Hello and welcome to a special episode here of the Bazaar Over Explained. And today we're actually going to be looking at just an overview of the new patch here. I have a couple different topics I want to cover, namely different builds on each of the characters, the overall state of the game, and basically how the overall meta has progressed now that we are a couple weeks in to Season 1. So some interesting questions that were asked at the beginning of the meta here, or beginning of the season rather, were how Vanessa was going to ultimately end up both with the new character coming into play with the new expansions, but also the first character that has multiple expansions. Because with multiple expansions, this is going to basically kind of dilute the overall consistency that you're going to be able to have across your Vanessa runs. So you're going to have to get creative and ultimately figure out different ways to incorporate the items into your builds from a larger pool and maybe have a little less consistent of like your one weapon builds or your aquatic builds and things of that nature. But let's take a look at some of the Vanessa builds that I think have been having some great success in the meta. So I've taken a look at a lot of the builds that were posted actually in the Discord server for the Bazaar, where people can post their builds, and taken a smattering of them who have had some 10 wins. And we can see that one weapon builds are still very viable in the meta. We can see from this user here, Silkon, how they have ultimately crafted a pretty standard one weapon build and one that's very effective. One of the things that I'll point out here too is that they have this 10 wins perfect victory, and I think that's kind of the name of the game with Vanessa right now. A lot of the late game builds that we see for characters like Mak, Dooley, and generally even Pygmalion are going to be a lot stronger than what Vanessa is trying to do in the late game currently. That's not to say that Vanessa can't have an incredibly potent late game build. We can actually see some of the most strong and ridiculous late game builds from Vanessa with items like the boulder, but it's having these one weapon item builds that have kind of been the bread and butter of Vanessa, along with weapon spam builds, aquatic builds, poison based builds, and we've gotten now with the elemental depth charge these fire builds. So those have been kind of the cornerstones of what Vanessa tries to do, but still one weapons are viable. The only problem is we have seen a resurgence of freeze and slow from Dooley, who we will get to in a little bit. So the builds that I think are consistently actually having the most success from Vanessa that I've seen across the board, and ones that have certainly ended my runs or ended the runs of other folks pretty effectively, are these sort of weapon spam builds. We can see that this user here, Moglor, has constructed a katana build that's going very quickly here, but we can even see, they have this diamond tier silencer, and they have what seems to be obsidian katana, they have a hasted cloak, all of these things really enabling that katana, but it doesn't even have its cooldown reduced. It's already one of the fastest weapons that Vanessa has access to, but it's really what's over here, these other 5 slots, that interests me, because this is kind of what I'm seeing across the board, is that we get a lot of small weapons or medium to small weapons, and we synergize with different weapon skills, getting some more crit chance, getting some more attack damage on our board, and trying to win as fast as possible. Because again, the builds that are very scary right now tend to be these Dooley builds. Now, if you've been playing the Bazaar recently, this build that I have in front of you is not going to be anything new. Regardless, classy with your 10 wins and your perfect victory. Congratulations to you. But this build that we're seeing here, these Dooley bugs, plus the drill, plus the robotics factory, or some variation of this, is an incredibly popular build on Dooley right now. Every time that I'm going and firing up a run of the Bazaar, I feel like I'm at least running into this build at least 3 to 4 times during my run, which is pretty crazy to think about, just given how many different characters there are, and just ultimately how many different synergies there are in the game. But this synergy in itself has a lot of good things going for it. One, it's really accessible. There's a lot of different ways to get small friend items from Dooley, whether you're going to Kina, whether you're going to Andy, whether you're actually going to the friend vendor itself. There's so many different ways for you to hunt for these bugs, and they have some super, super powerful synergies together, but in addition, they just work so incredibly effectively with the drill. So every time one of these bugs is going to go off, the drill is going to be charged for 2 seconds, and thus your drill is going off like crazy. You pair that up with something like a robotics facility, which says that all of these bugs have a 2 times multicast, then this drill is just going to be going to town. And again, we've seen this. We've also seen a couple variations of this build. So we see them incorporating items like Dualtron. We see this Shadow FTL here has even got Diamond Fangs and things of this nature, but predominantly the core is utilizing these bugs that we see here. And I want to note as well that if we're utilizing the small friend bug build for Dooley, we don't necessarily need all of the bugs. We can have maybe 3 or 4 of them, and that coupled with a robotics facility or coupled with a Dualtron, that's going to be enough to really kind of kickstart things and get them up to speed in a way that's going to be proccing very consistently. So we see that there's no firebug here, but the thing about that is realistically, we could have also potentially taken out this yellow mantis from this build and put in a different friend, and this build would be just as powerful as it is. I think the core of the build really is the blue beetle here. And with the blue beetle, we are seeing that it is potentially even permafreezing your opponent's board. And something like with Pierre Conditioner, you can generally lock your opponents out from completely being able to use any of their items when you're getting into the late stages of the game. So when looking at the blue beetle here, and I pulled up Bazaar.gg for us to do so, we're seeing that, it can be accessible as early as the bronze tier, which generally means that you're going to be able to find this early and often. And one thing that is really important about it is that it's freezing multiple items, even if it's for 0.5 seconds. We saw in these builds that they are going off so quickly and so consistently that the blue beetle itself can lock a opponent out of the game completely just because it has 2 times multicast, but it can also just slow them down so much that their build is not going to get off the ground realistically. So if anything was to change, and I imagine there will be a change here as Tempo generally puts out a patch, I want to say every 2 weeks, that either addresses something in the meta, changes it up, does some sort of hot fix. I would imagine we're going to be seeing something either to the blue beetle or one of the different small friend items. But I want to say that if there's one that is potentially most problematic, it could be blue beetle. You could see them do the treatment where what they did with the rays, which is that they had them offered at different tiers. Some were offered then at silver and some at gold and things of that nature when the ray build was very strong in season 0 at this point. And I imagine we'll see something like that where you can only find one of the different friends at a certain tier so the build is a little less consistent. Because now as it stands, it's pretty easy to do pretty much in all of your Dooley runs to get at least some portion of this build. So again, I want to jump back to this Vanessa build here and show how the meta is trying to adapt. So if you're Vanessa, again, you have to kill them early and often, and you're trying to do as much damage as possible. So you see, again, all these different weapons on the board. This is generally a pretty consistent strategy for trying to burst the Dooleys down as fast as possible in the days before you're getting to that late game. So getting your 10 wins as fast as you can and utilizing kind of a smattering of weapons to really get there. We know that the katana is core to this build, but we can see other builds that are utilizing all sorts of items. They're using the cutlass, it could be using shark claws. There's just so many different variations of the weapons build on Vanessa that are potent and powerful enough to actually combat the Dooleys. We also see that slow builds still have their potency here from user Martine80. We can see that, obviously some incredible synergy here with these dock lines, but realistically, the slow synergy builds do have a lot of power within them. It's just because Vanessa has a much wider item pool, we're not as consistently able to create the slow item build itself. And that's because there's not as many payoffs for slow as there are when we can just buy a smattering of weapons and put them on our board. It's still incredibly potent, but it's just really a matter of working with this larger item pool that we have to kind of look and see what can we consistently build in each of our runs, or what sort of builds can we go for in our runs or have an aim to go for that are going to allow us to get that coveted 10-win victory. And when we can't get those consistent weapon builds, we can get these builds that are incorporating items like the Sea Dog's Saloon and the Shark Ray and the Shipwreck that are going to be empowering our aquatic builds to get absolutely crazy. Let's look a little deeper here. So obviously this user has some incredible synergies on their board. Worm Train here on Discord. So looking at these different builds, really leveraging these items like the Shipwreck or like Sea Dog Saloon, or just kind of where we were before with Vanessa in Season 0, where we're trying to get these large items that really facilitate um, these powerful synergies on our board. That's kind of the name of the game here, yet again, when we're not doing these weapons builds. There's so many different synergies and powerful builds that you can get when you have the Shipwreck. This obsidian 3 times multicast Shark Ray is obviously impressive. That's a really big item. But again, there's a lot of different items that you could fit onto this board, all resting on the Shipwreck here to kind of get it up and running. We can also see that the Sea Dog Saloon 2 is a pretty real item here. It being obsidian is also pretty gross. So this is a super cool build. Obviously, this one is maybe not one you're going to get so consistently, but just giving you guys some ideas here on when you're playing Vanessa, what different things you can be looking for synergy-wise to really get up off the ground. And again, from this takeaway that I have here is that we can see some great aquatic synergies that are really going over the top with your shipwrecks. And when we can't string those synergies together, if we can't get the aquatic items and we can't get a full smattering of weapons on their boards, we can kind of go to the Wild West. And in that, we see this user. I'll be honest, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but regardless, still love the build here. We can see these different items coming together that we may not necessarily think that would have a powerful enough board to have a 10-win victory. One of them, namely, being Orange Julian here. This item is a pretty interesting one that, if you get early, can stack up some damage very, very quickly and very powerfully. And I pulled them up here on Bazaar.gg, and we can see from Orange Julian that they have this clause here: when you gain gold, increase the damage bonus of this item by the amount gained. And your weapons gain plus 10 damage for the fight, so it kind of has that initial start. But this item is truly a very real item on Vanessa that you can utilize into the late game to put on a ton of damage on your board. And just going back to this Vanessa build here, we can see that, yeah, putting that on a katana, putting that on a grenade, giving them lifesteal, putting more crit chance on your board, this is a really potent mix here. And again, I think the katana itself having such a low cooldown really speaks to the fact that Vanessas are trying to burst those Dooleys down so that they don't have to contend with all the freezing and slowing that we see from them. Additionally, we can think about characters like Mak, who are putting on so much poison, so much burn damage so quickly that you kind of have to kill them before that they kill you, essentially. Your best defense being a good offense. And with that, let's take a look at where Mak is at in the meta. So Mak actually has a lot of different interesting builds right now. I think there's just kind of a smattering of them across the board where a lot of the items are doing some really powerful things. We can think about archetypes like the slow archetype, the big vat archetype, the potions archetype, the regen archetype, the poppy field archetype. There's so many different ways that you can take Mak right now that it feels really exciting to play Mak. In fact, a lot of the builds that I even see on Discord are the ones that are posted about Mak. A lot of people are really excited to have the new character, and I think the character is really fun. So we can see here on Mak that some of the most powerful synergies just in the potions are utilizing things like Bottled Explosion and this Athenor here, which has been luckily nerfed so that it's not nearly as potent as it used to be. We're also really taking advantage of items like the Boiling Flask here that are giving 2 times multicast to our Bottled Explosion and ultimately are just allowing us to do some ridiculous damage on Mak. So for the Potions archetype, definitely still alive. But we're also seeing item builds with things like the Calcinator be really effective. This kind of goes into the burn synergies of Mak and how much burn damage Mak can put onto the board. You can really stack up a Calcinator super huge and then get something like the Fiery Claw that is going to do even more burn damage with that. It it is putting on just such a tremendous amount of burn damage that most characters really can't keep up defensive wise with the amount of burn that you're putting upon your opponents. In totality, I would say that if you have the option to go a burn build on Mac compared to going the poison build on Mac, let's say if you're trying to stack an item like the Calcinator, you really want to do so. The Calcinator just putting on burns damage, which is essentially doing damage 2 times faster than poison damage, is some of the strongest damage that you can do in the game. It's some of the fastest ticking damage at that. And also, if you're thinking about in the meta, when you're facing something like a regeneration based opponent, which Mac has some great regeneration builds, as we'll see in a moment, you want to be doing fire damage and not poison damage because that regeneration is effectively counteracting that poison damage. That's not to say that you can't stack a retort or even use the Eludel or Aludel, however you pronounce it, to great success. It's just if you're trying to be consistent, the Calcinator stacking is probably going to be what you want to do. And as we see from this user Argent here, they had a pretty nice fire build indeed. And speaking of regen builds here, this is a very powerful strategy that you can be utilizing on Mac, and certainly one that will allow you to get many victories, but it is a little trickier to do. And I would say that when I say tricky, it's more so that it just needs some really big numbers for it to be super effective. And when I say really effective, that's really so that it can synergize with your Staff of the Moose. I pulled up Staff of the Moose here, and it says that your weapons have plus damage equal to your regeneration. So we see when we combine that with things like the Goop Flail, we can put on a tremendous amount of damage, and we see a fiery Goop Flail here, one of my favorite synergies, and it is going to really wreck your opponents. The thing is, the Moose Staff is very, very slow. It again has a 10-second cooldown, and getting to that 10 seconds in the late game, which is generally when you're going to be having the Staff of the Moose, is not always something that you're going to be able to do consistently. So getting your build up and running and off the ground, that's kind of like the big weakness I would say that Mac has. That and that Mac doesn't have a ton of HP starting out, so you kind of have to offset that. The regeneration stacking definitely does do that to a degree, but again, you can see these weapon builds from Vanessa and even these really fast damage builds that are from Dooley with the Friends build are ones that can really burst through a Mac. But I would say that once Mac gets going, they really have the opportunity to do some crazy things. And we see that right here on display where they actually are trying to utilize these runic potions and to get a little bit more of their HP back. I imagine this user Hidora999 here had a good amount of regeneration to begin with, but they're trying to use that runic potion to leverage that so that when they're an opponent is trying to burst them down, that they ultimately are able to fight back through the lifesteal on their weapons, also utilizing items that give them a 100% crit chance, a strength potion, things of that nature. But overall, congratulations on your 10 gold win victory here. But I think one of the most consistent builds that you can be utilizing on Mac to both fight the meta of people that are trying to burst you down and also utilize a lot of the nice starting slow early synergies that you can get into the game, into the late game, is the slow build on Mac. This utilizes Magnus's Femur to ultimately be the one carry weapon that can really do an obscene amount of damage to your opponents. And if you have a way to give this lifesteal, as we see with this runic potion, or even again the shielding modifier that you see here, you can do some pretty absurd things. And we love to see this diamond dock lines incorporated into the build too. That's a nice get here on Mac. And I want to point out some interesting thing here that may not be apparent to folks that are trying to go for the slow build on Mac at first glance. We can see that this user here, Crate, has displayed it perfectly, where they're using the smelling salts not to haste the femur, but to haste their other slowing enabler. And this in its own right is going to get your femur off the ground. You don't need to put haste on the femur. As long as your slow items are going as fast as possible, that's really what's going to allow you to get that femur charged up and going, just like a machine gun on your opponents. It's good stuff. But Mac would also not be complete if we did not have the Big Vat build, which we see utilizing the synergy from Boiling Flask here. So let's see, Enigma No Name, the user here, has figured it out, and it's a pretty powerful one where if you are selling a potion so that your big vat of acid has this potion property, you can put it next to a boiling flask so that it has 2 times multicast. And let's pull up that item real quick. So with the vat of acid, we are burning and poisoning for each type that it has. And so if we're getting all these different types onto the vat of acid, we can stack it up super, super big, hit our opponent twice with it, and ultimately that's probably game over if we hit them once. To think about just how much burn and poisoning we're going to be doing all at once, that's enough to take down most builds. And we see that here with this 10 gold and win victory here from Nigma No Name. We've also used the Dragon Heart here for that same synergy where, or for the synergy where it's even buffing up the amount of fire damage that they're doing. But realistically, again, 132 poison. We're also seeing some more poisoning and more burn from this cauldron over here. Once this goes off, and once it goes off once, that's maybe all you need to end the fight. So a pretty consistent build that's showing up on Mac 2, and one that you kind of have to prepare for if you're trying to think about how to counter the builds in the meta. And speaking of builds that you need to be prepared for, and ones that are putting on a lot of poison damage, this is the Poppy Field build. This is another pretty popular one that we have seen on Mac, and Demo 3x9 has displayed it here very well for us, where they even, I believe, have a poisonous poppy field that is just stacking an incredible amount of poison. You use it with a spider mace. A spider mace is going off like crazy. We can get other items that are small to synergize with it that are also going off pretty crazily here so that you're stacking up all this poison. And then we're utilizing an item like the Plague Glaive to really seal the deal. So this is a pretty common one on Mac that you're going to see too. One that is, I would say, a little less consistent just because it does rely on the poppy field so heavily. But now with the addition of Mandala, you can transmute items and you can transmute your large items fishing for this poppy field. So if you're willing to do it, if you're willing to go maybe not stacking your calcinator and things of this nature, not utilizing the reagents and trying to get value for that, you can just buy a large item early and then you use Mandala to keep trying to transmute it into a poppy field or really whatever large item that you're looking for on Mac. And we talked about it pretty briefly here, but now I want to talk about kind of two things. One is Pygmalion, and the other is how we are countering the meta, how we are essentially taking all this information, seeing all these builds, and what we are doing to respond. And I think that really starts well when talking about Pygmalion, because Pygmalion has had to do, I think, the most adaptation to really fight what the meta is doing. So one of the responses that we can have to the meta is something like freeze. Freeze build is something that's very consistent. It's something that we can utilize on Pygmalion specifically to kind of combat a lot of the blue beetle and the freezing that's done by Dooleys and utilize that to our advantage. So we see that we have something like Steam Ladle that it says whenever you're freezing, it's gaining more burn, but also when we're freezing our opponent, we're disrupting them. We're potentially disrupting this kind of like infinite bug drill loop where we are creating just enough space for ourselves where we can put enough burn damage on them, have enough defenses that ultimately we can survive that barrage. And I've actually pulled up one of my own videos where I showcase this, where this Pig Ice Club counters the meta, or Pig Ice Build counters the meta video, where we're seeing that, yeah, we can use this Ice Club to ultimately utilize our opponent's freezing against them. And if we're facing 3 to 4 different Dooleys every single run, we know that we're going to be facing some amount of blue beetle. And if we know that freezing our enemies is going to be a pretty potent way to do that, the Giant Ice Club is a very real and very powerful, and I dare say semi-consistent item that we can get on Pygmalion. Not one that is, I would say they're available to you every run, but if you can get it, it's one that will allow you to at least defeat a lot of the Dooleys if we know that a lot of the Dooleys are going to be utilizing that friend build. And another way that we could potentially do that is just survival. So having all this max HP, we can see from this user, that bird, they have 397,000 HP. That's a crazy, ludicrous amount. They have the duplicate on the belt here. That's absolutely insane, along with the Lion's Cane. But these builds that just ultimately say, I'm going to one-shot you, are very potent and still very powerful. The problem is, again, we are facing a lot of freeze and a lot of slow. So having something like this, we can say, yeah, we can generally survive what you're doing damage-wise to us, and maybe this is enough HP in its own right to not be affected by the amount of damage that a Dooley is putting on. But ultimately, we have to be able to fight back somehow. We have to be able to be at least somewhat proactive, and that's where getting something like a Radiant double whammy or a Radiant Lion's Cane are things that we'd really want to be looking for, but we can't rely on these enchantments. And that's what we can really rely on most of all out of all the variables that we can control within the random nature of the bazaar is the items we purchase. So again, purchasing and going for these specific builds may not be something that's available to you every run, but at least having an understanding of what builds you could potentially get into and what options may be in front of you is how we would want to be combating and being, I guess, at play here in season one. And now going back to the other characters again on the topic of countering these builds, we kind of touched on it a little bit with each character. But if we're thinking if we were playing Dooley, I wanted to point out this Dualtron build here because it's one where it points out the kind of big thing here. If we're both showing up with the same build, how do we get the advantage? It's like, well, you need something to go over the top. And that's where we see something like this Dualtron is going to pump out a ton of damage that is ultimately going to break the stalemate that you and your opponent have with your friend's build. We see a lot of these builds incorporate the robotics factory, but generally we also see something like DJ Robot as well. But you need to have something that is going to put you over the top. We can see it with Dualtron. We can also see it with items like Bulldozer. So Bulldozer is something that, again, it's a large item, so you're not going to get it as consistently as Dooley because you don't have so many ways to fish for those types of shops. Bulldozer, in its own right, though, has this 30% cooldown reduction on your friends, and even this 10% cooldown reduction on your friends can be something crazy to allow you to go over the top of the other Dooleys. It's also something here where you can utilize this clause here when you're using a friend, it gains damage to just push that damage over the top of the other Dooleys. And going back to Vanessa here, and I'm not sure if I talked about this build here from Null, we can use kind of the smattering of weapons to just go as fast and do as much damage as possible to defeat Dooley, but also importantly, Mak. If Mak and Dooley are represented in a lot of these different runs, we can utilize some damage scaling from Shark Claws and things of that nature, some crit chance as well to really maximize as much damage as we're putting on as quickly as possible, really fishing for and prioritizing our crit chance skills so that we are trying to, again, go as fast, as hard as possible so that we are ultimately, one, not trying to get into the late game, and late game is kind of what I would consider after you get your level 10 enchantment. So we're trying to get as many wins as early as possible, but also we're trying to end the game as early as possible. So seeing that this user here, Null, had about 4,000 max HP, I would assume that they had gotten this 10-win victory somewhere in like the 11 to 13, maybe 11, 12, 13 day mark. So they had a lot of damage, pretty consistent with it, and were able to go over the top of their opponent. And if you're Mak, what are you doing? What are you doing to counter something like the Dooley? Well, again, Dooley is going to be going off at a pretty consistent pace, and we can look at the item timings for that actually. We can look at all those small friends that we see where we see Black Spider going off every 6 seconds, Blue Beetle 6 seconds, Charcoal is one that we kind of see in some builds, but not really a lot of them. Green Wasp 6 seconds, Red Firefly 6 seconds, Yellow Mantis again 6 seconds. So that 6-second mark is a very crucial point, and if we can get our build up and running before these Dooleys can actually get off the ground, that's where we can start to counter them and get those wins. So again, on Mak, how do we do that? Well, if we have an ability to get up something like a Poppy Field, which ultimately with something like this Toxic Fang is, something that we're not going to get every single run, but something that will allow our builds to get online much more quickly because Toxic Fang has such a low cooldown. We can start to really push out this poison damage and really push out a lot of damage very quickly. The thing about the Dooley build is that it tends to lock you out of the game before it kills you. So it's slowing you, it's freezing you, and then the drill is going off. But the drill, if it's reaching internal cooldown, it's still going to be utilizing something like 75 to 125 damage that it's going to be going through and cycling through, which don't get me wrong, it is a lot, but it's not enough in these late game areas where we're having like 7,000 or like 4,000 to 7,000 health to really get over that finish line. Like they're trying to ultimately stop you from doing what you're doing, and then over time they will destroy you through the enchantment that's probably on the drill that could be fiery or poison, or the poison or fiery that is already on their items innately through these different small friends. So if we think about that, all we really need to do if we are on Mac is put some elemental effect onto the Dooley and stack it up quickly enough to where they aren't going to be able to kill us before they are killed by the ticking damage on them, that damage over time. So poison on Mac, I talked about how it's not really where I want to be. However, if you have a way to get your poison off and running very quickly, that is still going to be very potent when we're looking at builds that have very little in the way of survivability. Currently in the meta, you can't really be utilizing shield builds very effectively just because of how disruptive that Dooley build is, but also because of how much fire damage and poison damage the Macs are putting onto you. Additionally, the Vanessas, again, if they are pushed to try and go as fast as possible, you may not even be able to be defensive enough and put your defenses up quickly enough with your shielding to even fight the Vanessas. So you have to be proactive. You have to be utilizing builds that are ultimately going to put the damage onto your opponent quicker than they are going to put it on you. If we are seeing successful builds in the meta that are utilizing defenses, it can look like Mac builds that are utilizing all these different potions. We can see this is a really nice potion build, by the way, from user Eureka here, that is just going to be healing themselves over and over again for their entire health pool, just consistently utilizing this haste potion. So they're just kind of not even defensive as much as they are just counteracting all the damage that has been done in a ridiculous way. So, again, they're not shielding, and the healing that they're doing is not like damage over time healing. It's one-shot healing, but additionally, we can do something like regeneration, which we saw again from this user here, that the regeneration will allow us to facilitate some very powerful offense if our offensive items can go off. But again, the Dooley builds are going to be disrupting you. The Vanessa builds are going to be trying to kill you. So we can utilize regeneration. However, we have to understand that it needs to go off quickly. If it's not going off quickly, then we need a way to counteract that. And regeneration can do that, but when you're getting into the later portions of the game, it gets harder and harder to do so. All this said and all this exhaustive over explaining and all this animation here from me when I'm generally the Bazaar Whisperer, I will say we are probably going to get a patch soon, so a lot of this will be changing. However, I can't imagine that it's going to be changing too much from where we've seen it before. I would say that what we see from Tempo is they do kind of these large passes over these items, like we've heard Reynad speak about, and he's also spoken about how every time you speak about him, you give misinformation about what he says, so you can go hear exactly what he has said through his own words and through his own videos. But generally what we see from my perspective with Tempo is that they're looking at items and they're really balancing them kind of one large pass at a time. And we see the hot fixes, and I imagine we'll get a hot fix for Dooley, but I also imagine that we're going to get some new item updates for different characters too. Just pulling up the patch notes for a second here in Mobilytics, we can even see that they're giving us like new different items to work with on different characters. We can think about how Landscraper has been reworked. We can think about how Pitchfork is a new item in the game for Pygmalion. We can look at seeing how diving helmets been redesigned and things of this nature. So they are really, I think, trying to add a lot of depth and diversity to our builds. And if we know what we're going to be expecting within our builds, we can have a game plan that will ultimately allow us to try and proactively fight the meta as kind of a top-down perspective of thinking about what we need to be doing with our items, but those items can look different run to run. And I think that's the beauty of this game. You know, we see the different item builds that really, again, even in this video, run the gambit. If it's something like this Vanessa, or for Mac utilizing potions, and or Dooley, okay, we won't speak about Dooley, but if we're Pygmalion, we're finding ways to adapt and we're putting in these different items that we may not necessarily see in every single run. And we are allowing ourselves to get that 10-win victory just by knowing what we need to do. So now my goal here is that if you have this knowledge, that you can feel ultimately empowered to go into the bazaar, try some new items out, and get some 10-win victories. All this said, I have been and still continue to be the Bazaar Whisperer. I really appreciate you all viewing this video here, and I like to say that, you know, if it's your second time viewing the channel, you could leave a like button, leave a like. There you go. You could hit that like button. That really helps me out a lot. You can also, if you're a third time viewer, if you've seen these videos for the third time, you can hit that coveted subscribe button. But I'm not going to tell you what to do. Just going to give you suggestions as to how to live your life and how to play the Bazaar. And the thing that I also like to say here is thank you for viewing the entire video. I know it's been a long one. Then if it's been a long one, the likelihood is you are asleep. And if you're asleep, I wish you a very good night.